So from my fellow panelists, we've learned that we've all been born into a world that's been deeply shaped by the social construction of race. Especially here on Long Island, which remains extremely racially segregated, we cannot avoid all of the messages that we continuously get about race, even if we aren't consciously paying attention to them. We watch the news and see images of people doing the same thing, but it's framed totally differently depending on their race. Here are victims of Hurricane Katrina. They are both seen with food in their hands. The black person is said to be looting, while the white people are framed as finding food. We see way more headlines about Latino immigrants on Long Island that look like this: new arrivals, new violence. Then we do that look like this: study finds that immigrants are central to Long Island's economy. These examples are part of the fog that we are constantly breathing in. Other things that we breathe in are conversations that we hear from people around us. These conversations might take the form of talking about those people, which uses specific incidences to make generalizations about a whole race. The fog also includes our education, what we learn in school, and most importantly, what we don't learn about our race's past. This fog exists all around us, and we breathe it in, and as we breathe it in, we internalize these stereotypes and assumptions on a subconscious level. And this subconscious is expressed through implicit racial biases, which is the brain's automatic instant association of stereotypes or attitudes towards particular groups without our conscious awareness.
At the most basic level, implicit biases are thoughts. They're thoughts that we have and what we formally talk about in social cognition as learned associations. But what's unique about these particular thoughts is that these are thoughts that individuals are not necessarily aware that they have them in their minds. And they're also thoughts that sometimes automatically pop up in our minds, meaning that we have no control over when the conditions under which they pop up in our minds, and sometimes they pop up fairly quickly. Now these thoughts, as some people already talked about this, are based on culture.
So one of the things that we need to talk about when it comes with implicit bias is this concept of we're not really doing it on purpose, right? It's something that is unconscious. It is an approach, a way of seeing the world, a way of understanding the world that is informed and framed by our experiences. We know that implicit bias is something that also is involuntary, and so it's something that we are inherently unaware of. The other thing that we need to know about implicit bias is that it doesn't just live in our brains. Implicit bias also presents in our day-to-day interactions. And so one of the things that we recognize is that our implicit bias and these sort of subconscious understandings also inform our actions that we have with other people. In particular, implicit bias is based on fear. And the idea of fear is who are the people we were taught are different from us? Who are the people that we were taught that we need to be concerned about? Who are the people that we were taught that need to be separate from us? And who are, more importantly, who are the people that we're taught that are like us? And so the idea of implicit bias inherently sets up those boundaries between us and them. And so one of the things and the ways that implicit bias then plays out is that we see this if these people are different to us by age, ethnicity, appearance. Those are going to be the ways that we're going to treat the people who are like us in a good way, and we're going to treat the people who are not like us in a way that's informed by fear.
So when in social psychology, when we do these nifty experiments and we show faces of black males, the automatic association that people have with black males is anything and everything related to criminality. And there's now many studies showing this.
Even on Long Island, we see that non-whites on the island are nearly 5 times as likely as white individuals to be arrested on charges, typically resulting from traffic stops. And even we see similar rates with looking at drug possession arrests, even though studies do show that white individuals and minorities use drugs at about the same rate. In Suffolk County, non-white individuals accounted for 25% of the population, but 53% of all felony arrests in the past decade. In Nassau County, we see the non-whites make about 30% of the population, but 67% of all felony arrests.
Implicit bias does the work of structural racism without lifting a finger. It's something that exists inside of all of us, and it allows structural racism to perpetuate and to have the effects that it's intended to have.
When implicit racial biases start to show up, or the individuals have these implicit racial biases and they're part of the institutions, these institutions are the sources of structural racism. So in other words, structural racism, which is a function of the racism within institutions, is also a function of the kinds of implicit biases that the individuals who are members of these institutions carry around.
Infant mortality rates in neighborhoods like Uniondale and Nassau County are 13 times higher than infant mortality rates in the neighborhoods like East Meadow.
And in fact, in Nassau County, our rate of mortality for breast cancer for Black women is 27.6 per 10,000 compared to 19.2 for white women. So non-white patients are considered to have or prescribed less pain medications, and Black patients are thought to tolerate pain better than whites. Also, patients of color are more likely to be blamed for being too passive about their health care.
And in employment, researchers have consistently found that when all variables are held constant except for the applicant's name, job applicants with white-sounding names receive significantly more callbacks and interviews than applicants with Black-sounding names.
In schools, teachers' implicit racism is related to their anxiety when they're teaching kids from groups that are not part of their own groups. Also, their lesson quality as judged by objective judges, people who have no idea the levels of implicit bias that a teacher may have, that implicit racial bias is related to the lesson quality in the classroom. And last, and definitely not least, implicit racial bias is related to student performance as well.
So what can we do about this? How can we address something that resides in our subconscious? Researchers generally agree that biases are malleable and that implicit bias may be unlearned. Techniques to address implicit bias are called debiasing. While there are a lot of debiasing techniques, and more come out the more that we study this, I'll just quickly mention two that I think are the most important. The first one is exactly what we're doing this morning, which is creating a foundation for understanding how implicit bias works. This includes trying to understand where it comes from, such as understanding our history better, and learning about the common forms of implicit biases so we're better able to detect them when they're played out. And this second debiasing technique is one of the most important, I think. It's working to diversify your workplaces and your communities. Creating direct intergroup contact lessens the effect of that fog that we're constantly taking in from the media and news and other people around us that live in our segregated communities. This alone would have a huge impact on breaking the cycle between structural racism and implicit racial bias.